Greetings. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth and final session in a conference we've been having at the Center for Global Development all of this week on different aspects of financing for low-income countries. So we've had a session on issues relating to debt and debt sustainability, one around private capital flows for low-income countries, and one on mobilizing domestic resources for low-income countries. All of these sessions are now available on our website if you want to go into the substantive discussions in each of those areas. And today we're going to try and bring those different issues together to have a conversation on where do we go from here? What are the concrete steps that can be taken after what was really, I think, in all 3 days, a fairly sobering presentation in terms of the prospects facing low-income countries to provide adequate financing for progressing on their development agenda. And today we have a special pleasure for me to co-host this session with my friend Mary Lou Uy, who is the director of the G24, which is the intergovernmental group of 24 countries, mostly emerging markets and developing countries, focusing on finance and on development. So I'll be turning over to Mary Lou for her welcome in a minute. Then we're going to get a presentation by my colleague Sudhir Shetty, who's going to summarize what came out of the conversations over the past 3 days. And then we have a terrific panel, which Mary Lou will introduce, and a distinguished group of invited participants who are also online and whose videos will become miraculously visible at the appropriate moment. So I'm looking forward to the next hour and a half or so. And I'd like to now at this point turn it over to Mary Lou. Welcome to this.
Thank you, Masood. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you very much to your team and to you for the invitation to collaborate and also to co-moderate. The topic of financing for development for low-income countries is extremely important to many developing countries. We are just starting through our annual meetings this week, and if anything, that's at the very top of the agenda. Let me start by saying that enabling low-income countries and other vulnerable developing countries to raise the necessary financing for development and to support their efforts towards the economic recovery after COVID will really make a lot of difference on how living standards will evolve in these countries and will change over the medium term. So let me just give a number that I got from the IMF yesterday, which is pre-COVID, GDP per capita of low-income countries was expected to grow cumulatively by 20% between 2019 and 2025. Post-COVID, this projected cumulative growth is now estimated to about 12 to 13%. This means that these economies will lose nearly 30% of their prospective and expected improvement in living standards, and that includes reversing progress in poverty reduction over the medium term. This, by the way, is an average projection, which is subject to a lot of downside risks. So there is a lot of stake in what could happen with financing for development. And today I hope that we will discuss what we could say as an upside to this projection and to this very gloomy scenario. And much more specifically, as Masood said, we hope that the takeaways will give us some indication on national actions as well as international actions to help low-income developing countries go through the medium-term challenge. Now, that said, it is a great pleasure to welcome our excellent panel of policymakers to provide valuable country perspectives and development experts who truly amplify the voice of developing countries. So let me first turn to His Excellency, and I hope that she connects at some point, Zainab Ahmed, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning for Nigeria. Minister Ahmed is the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning for Nigeria since 2019. And prior to that, she was also Minister of Finance for Nigeria, and also the Executive Secretary of the Nigeria Executive Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. The other is the next panelist is Deputy Minister Charles Boahen, and he's still not connected, but I hope he eventually does, Deputy Minister of Finance of Ghana. The third panelist is Chela Pazar Basholu. I got that right, Chela. Director of Strategy, Policy and Review Department of the IMF. Chela is also used to be, prior to that, a month ago, she served as Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions at the World Bank Group, where she actually worked on the bank's assistance to low and middle income countries. Now, Garji Ghosh is the President of Global Policy and Advocacy of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Garji, if I may, is the President of the Global, also oversees the foundation's regional offices and strategic presence in Europe and East Asia. Garji also serves as on the board of ComFed USA and previously served in President Obama's Global Development Council. So thank you for joining us today. Now, before we turn to the panelists, I would like to then turn to Mr. Sudhir Shetty. Sudhir, a good friend, is currently non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development and professional lecturer at the Elliott School for International Affairs at George Washington University. Previously, he also had a very long career at the World Bank. So let me turn to Sudhir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Lou. Good to see you, and good day to all of you. So my charge today in the next 12 to 15 minutes is to, as Masood said, is to summarize and synthesize the main points that emerged from the first 3 days of this conference, which some, but not all of you probably attended. And then I'll hand back to Masood and Mary Lou for a discussion with our distinguished panel. Masood began this conference on the first day by exhorting those attending to focus on identifying practical ways forward and to combine realism and creativity in doing so. I think he's done that. I think the presenters and the panelists and others have done that. So I hope to give you a sense of the tenor of the discussions. Could I have the slides, please? Thank you. Next slide. So essentially, let me start with 3 takeaways that I took from the last 3 days based on the discussions. The first was that COVID-19 has complicated and worsened an already bad situation regarding debt sustainability of low-income countries. Mary Lou already mentioned what the likely projections are regarding growth, and we know that growth is one of the biggest determinants of debt sustainability. Now, going into the crisis, by the IMF's estimates and the World Bank's estimates, over 40% of the world's low-income countries were already either in high debt distress or at risk of debt distress. And that number is undoubtedly going to increase with the shock of COVID-19. So the implication of this is that it's now time to seek blanket solutions to what is likely to be a solvency problem rather than just a liquidity problem that faces these countries. The second takeaway had to do with what has been called the billions to trillions agenda, that of attracting private capital to low-income countries. And again, even here, before COVID-19, things weren't exactly humming along. But obviously, COVID-19 has made this a much bigger challenge. And the takeaway is that what will be needed are not piecemeal, but rather strategic and coordinated changes, including in how development finance institutions or DFIs operate. And the third takeaway had to do with, if you will, the third leg of financing for development, which is domestic revenue mobilization. And here, the key takeaway is that COVID-19 means that there is a need now to strike a balance between noting that in the short term, the pandemic will impact these countries adversely, impact their domestic revenue mobilization adversely. But in the long term, there remains this challenge of considering how the tax system can contribute to sustained and inclusive growth by enhancing efficiency and equity. Next slide, please. So let me now take each of these in order. First, on debt sustainability. Here, history has shown us that we're not very good at dealing with debt crises. There is a tendency to postpone the reckoning, and this has meant that past crises have been prolonged. There is too much of a tendency to look at these as liquidity crises rather than solvency crises. In this regard, the G20's DSSI is it's a good first step, but it's only a first step, and more needs to be done. And the discussion focused on a couple of areas. One, that there is a need to get debt restructuring going faster in two ways. One, by persuading private lenders to move more quickly. And second, that's basically given how important private lenders have become. And second, by finding ways to get major non-Paris Club lenders involved. So recognizing in effect that the world has changed a lot since the HIPC initiative of the early 2000s. There's also a need to make the DSSI itself more effective. There were a couple of different suggestions here, which it might be worth discussing, determining when repayment suspensions are appropriate, making sure that much higher levels of financing can be provided, conditioning financing from the fund and from MDBs on private creditor participation so that to reduce their tendency to free ride. But in addition, there's also a continuing agenda here on helping recipient countries in improving, on one hand, their debt management, as well as on the other hand, the management of public investment, which is, after all, where a lot of this debt is going, and to ensure that this debt is used well, so that the next crisis doesn't happen quite as quickly as this crisis has come upon us. Next slide, please. On enhancing the flow of private capital, as I said, much of this has to do with finding ways for bilateral and multilateral development finance institutions, DFIs, to be more effective in catalyzing private capital. There were a number of suggestions here which were largely around the idea of needing to reform the ways in which these development finance institutions work, the ways in which they operate. For instance, setting targets for their shares of their commitments and concessional financing that actually go to low-income countries as opposed to middle-income countries, changing their models so that they're able to take on more risk, implementing compacts within multilateral DFIs in particular to promote reforms at a sectoral level that could help crowd in private capital, helping them fill in gaps in local capital markets so that over time these are strengthened. There was also a discussion about how it might be helpful to have compacts at the country or sectoral level that could promote reforms at the country level that reduce risks. Because after all, this is about crowding in private capital, so improving the environment for private business is a particular priority. And then I think there's also a question as to whether multilateral DFIs are adequately capitalized. Next slide, please. Finally, on the third leg, as I put it, which is domestic revenue mobilization, little doubt that this is very important, a very important part of the agenda, but acknowledgement that it's a very complicated area. It's an area in which the World Bank, the IMF, bilateral donors, countries have been engaged for many years with not tremendous amounts of success to show for it. A couple of points here. One, and these are lessons, if you will, both from successes and failures, about the critical need to combine both the technical expertise of knowing what is to be done with the political judgment of knowing when it is to be done and how it should be phased. A second point here is that this isn't just about tax authorities or revenue authorities, it's about the whole of government. And thirdly, that it needs to be nested within the overall economic context of a country and its development strategy. So spurring domestic revenue mobilization in a resource-rich country poses a different set of challenges than in countries that are not resource-rich. And the complication that COVID-19 brings in here, obviously, is that this is clearly not the time to be thinking of raising taxes. This is a time, as the managing director of the IMF put it a couple of days ago, this is the beginning of the great ascent, and it needs different priorities. However, the recovery will come, and the focus really is on how revenues are going to be boosted over the medium term. So this is another of those cases where there are short-term priorities and there are medium-term priorities. But cutting across this, there's a sense that in all of these countries, tax administration remains an area of priority, one that needs continued focus, both by the countries themselves as well as the partners who assist them. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to leave you with what I took away as two cross-cutting issues across these three areas that were discussed. The first was how COVID-19 has now helped shine a light on the fact that financing for the SDGs requires short-term actions as well as longer-term actions. It requires a combination of these. And in the short term now, clearly there is a need for quick and systemic rethinking of debt sustainability to allow these countries to make it through this current crisis without losing, as it were, a generation. There is a need also for these countries to continue on the path of reforms that are aimed at inclusive growth. The reforms that many of them had been already implementing before COVID-19 hit, those are no less important in the current context, although clearly their phasing and their prioritization will need to be rethought. And for the donors, there's a need to continue to maintain ODA flows, which unfortunately are showing signs of flagging in the face of weaknesses in advanced economies. In the longer term, there is a need to go back to this agenda of thinking about how to boost domestic revenue mobilization sustainably. There's a need for countries to think about how to undertake the fiscal consolidation that will be needed over the medium term. And very importantly, as is always the case with thinking about financing for the SDGs, there's need for countries with the support of their partners to think financing goals are effective and well targeted to achieve inclusive growth. The second cross-cutting issue, again, not surprisingly, is the need for coordination and partnership at a global level. This goes back, in a sense, to the consensus at Monterey, which, now that I think about it, was almost 17 years ago, 2003. And this means that that each group will need to do different things. The low-income countries that receive this financing will need to remain committed to their reforms that aim to spur growth, to bring about inclusion, and to achieve the SDGs. But they need to do that, obviously, even as they address the impacts of the pandemic in the short term. Donors will need to continue to try to raise ODA and recognize that their commitments in this regard have continued to fall behind expectations. But they also need to help the low-income countries address their debt problems and recognize that the world is very different, as I said, than it was when the HIPC initiative was implemented, so that there's a number of emerging donors that need to be brought on board. The MDBs will need to continue to engage with these countries, both on supporting reforms and building capacity, but also in finding ways to increase their concessional lending. And finally, there's an agenda which I've already spoken about for the development finance institutions, both bilateral and multilateral, which will need to adapt the way in which they work so that they can attract private capital by channeling more concessional resources to low-income countries and supporting the capital markets in those countries. So let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. Mary Lou.
Let me turn over to Masood or
Thank you very much, Mary Lou. And thank you very much, Sudhir, for that. So now you've listened to what the sort of summary of the previous 3 days. Everybody needs to try a bit harder. But I hope that in the conversation that we have now, we'll get a chance to both sort of take some of those ideas further, but also push back where you think some of those ideas aren't going to deliver, whether we need to think differently. So I'd like to start by turning to Minister Ahmed from Nigeria. Now, Minister, welcome. I think this is the first time that we actually have the opportunity to welcome you at the Center for Global Development. And it's a special pleasure for me it's not often that I find two people on the screen with the same surname. So special welcome. And I wanted to say, for Nigeria, it's really been a sort of double whammy. So you've been dealing with the health crisis, but then you've also been dealing with the revenue impact of the oil price fall. And in some ways, that's probably had an even bigger impact on public finances for you. You've listened to what 3 days of technical experts have been saying, and I wanted to get sort of your sense from where you sit. What is it that could be done that would help most countries like Nigeria and other resource-dependent countries, many of whom are struggling with the same kinds of challenges as you are? So let me turn it over to you. I think you're still on mute, Minister. Your camera still, your microphone is still on mute.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Apologies.
Perfect. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. Let me also say good day to all the panelists and the participants in this forum, and apologize that I haven't actually been available in the other 2 days. This is a peak of the budget season for us. And I just came from the Parliament submitting our 2021 budget proposals. So having said that, I'd like to agree with you that yes, the global pandemic for Nigeria was truly a double whammy. On the one hand, we were handling the health crisis, which requires a lot of unplanned spending. On the other hand, we have very low revenue as a result of the crash in the crude oil price in the international market. So we took a number of measures which required us to step back, review our medium-term plans, reviewed our budgets, cut out non-essential expenditure, and increase spending in the health sector in particular, and also increase spending in social development to help the people that were already vulnerable and more people that became vulnerable as a result of the pandemic. In revising our plans and the budget, we ended up with a much larger deficit than we started in 2020. And we have had to borrow more than we planned. Our revenues crashed by as much as 60%. The oil and gas revenues crashed by as much as 50%. So we were lucky we got some concessionary funds from the IMF. Thank you very much, IMF, for coming in very quickly to support us, and also other multilateral development finance institutions. Truly, IMF actually helped us to make a difference. And so we're able to suspend spending and consumption within the economy, ensuring that people are paid their salaries, providing support for small businesses so that they don't go under. But we now are faced with this increased debts and also even increased borrowing that we have to do come 2021, because the revenues will recover, but very, very slowly. We reached out to the IMF through our the country office in Nigeria to say we need some support from IMF on domestic revenue mobilization. So maybe some external views, some experts that have operated in the kind of very difficult fiscal situation that we find ourselves in, and also on a continuous risk assessment, as well as fiscal reporting. And we're working together with the IMF to make sure that that comes on stream. COVID is a very difficult challenge that we're in, but we also saw some very unique opportunities within this period that we very quickly took advantage of. For several years in our country, we've been subsidizing petrol for use of vehicles. And there has been several attempts to stop this for subsidies, but it always is, you move forward and you come back. But we took advantage of this opportunity when the prices were low to pull out the subsidy. So people were paying much lower than the fixed price, which we were subsidizing. We also took the opportunity to move to a service reflective tariff in the electricity sector, which was also heavily subsidized. So this meant that we're able to harness resources, which will have otherwise gone to subsidy, to apply to some other critical sectors of the economy. Not a popular decision, I must say. We're still having kickbacks back and forth, but this is something we have done, and we're sticking to it, and we're not moving back. We're also able to implement more reforms that will have been otherwise more difficult to implement. But the challenge that we have now made reforms more acceptable, more understandable to people. We have been part of the discussions around the DSSI, and when the G20 initially released its intervention to our countries, we jumped and said, this is an advantage we're going to take. But unfortunately, on closer review, on review of the loan agreements that we have taken with bilateral partners as well as with commercial parties, we now found ourselves really limited in being able to take advantage of these facilities, because some of our loan agreements had provisions that made it simply impossible for us to take the advantage of the DSSI. So I understand that there could be a DSSI 2.0. We hope in doing that the G20 considers the fact that it cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution, that there are challenges in different shades and variations of challenges that need to be looked at, so that we don't lose out on taking opportunity again in the next phase of the DSSI. This is something we want to take advantage of. And then we have a large proportion of our external debt, 40% of our external debt in commercial bonds. So we also have been opportune to be part of the discussions that is engaging these private lenders. Hopefully that we are able to get the private lenders as a group to also join the DSSI scheme or something equivalent to it, to give us some relief, which we really need now to improve our fiscal space. Let me just stop here at this time. Maybe I'll come around again with your permission, Mr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I'm sure many of our participants will have questions and comments for you as well. So we're looking forward to your further comments. Jada, can I turn to you? And first of all, also welcome you again for the first time in your new role here back at the center. And also, I want to particularly hope that you might touch on two areas. One, sort of debt. I know you've been working a lot on debt. Your team has been working on debt, and I think there's sort of the immediate set of issues around extending the debt service suspension initiative for a bit longer, making it work a bit better. I mean, at the end of the day, frankly, my view is, there's political energy spent on this, basically producing about $5 billion. A lot of it goes to a few countries. So, it's not exactly in comparison with, say, what the IMF has done in terms of new money, or even what the World Bank has committed. So there's that set of issues. How much energy and attention should one put on it? Should we really be focused very much on trying to get the private sector to participate in this? Is this likely, or is it essentially not going to get anywhere? And then the second thing around that is sort of looking forward. You saw the first line of Sudhir's second slide essentially said, find a blanket solution to debt, to solvency issues in low-income countries. The ministers just said that we shouldn't have a sort of one-size-fits-all solution. We need to take into account country variation. How does one balance that? Because clearly, there's a push to try and find some wholesale solution, and then there's a need to say, let's only do this country by country, which has its own pros and cons. So at least those, but any other points that you want to raise?
Thank you, Masood. Thank you, Marilu, and good day to all ministers and all the participants, everyone. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you at this very important discussion. Financing for development for low-income countries is really a key priority for the fund. And as our managing director said before, this is a crisis like no other, requires response like no other. So we are concerned, as you also mentioned, that the crisis may actually reverse some of the gains and really create a lost decade for many countries. So there is a really urgent need to act. And I think the issue that you mentioned, I want to talk about two issues. One is, and they're related, debt and domestic resource mobilization, because I think there are links there that we can also come up with some actions to going forward to enhance both of these very important areas. So on debt, DSSI was very important. I want to start by saying what we need to strive for is what I call good debt, which is growth enhancing debt. Because I think there are three types of debt: good debt, bad debt, and ugly debt. Ugly debt related to our work on anti-corruption and so on and so forth. Bad debt is when the capacity, debt management capacity, or dealing with certain creditors which have much better lawyers and capacity. So it's mainly better debt issues and better debt management. And that, I think, is critical in terms of providing capacity development to countries, which is many IFIs, of course, us and the bank and others do. And then there's good debt, which is we need to also acknowledge that, especially given the current conditions, countries need that. Countries are hit with, as the minister mentioned, with declining revenues, with very difficult prospects, and they do face large needs in terms of SDGs and infrastructure and so on. So how does one have DRM, so better tax capacity, better state capacity in this environment, as well as good debt? And of course, so that's looking forward, and I will come to that in a minute. Where we are, we already started this with very difficult conditions in terms of record high levels of private and public debt. COVID, I think, is of course, COVID exacerbated it, and we have now a very large legacy of debt. And for that, I think we need two key initiatives. One is on the private sector side, and I am worried about this as well, because what happens in corporates end up in bank balance sheets and then end up in sovereign balance sheets. So really not forgetting dealing with private sector debt and having insolvency regimes and mechanisms to deal with the legacy of private sector debt or SOE debt will be also very important. So that's one component. I think there's very good work at the bank, at the fund, capacity building in terms of out-of-court settlement systems, good insolvency regimes to make sure that we don't make it much worse for the official sector in terms of dealing with private sector debt. Now, in terms of public sector debt, there, of course, we are at historically high levels, especially lower income countries are over 50% were in debt distress or at high risk even prior to the crisis. And like you said, it's really an area that we need to work on very carefully. The DSSI, which was an important G20 initiative, which was called by the IMF and the World Bank president, like you said, it was a very important step. And I think I would like to underline that it's not just amounts. It's also the coordination among the G20, which is very critical going forward. Because as Sudhir showed in the slides, unless we have coordination and partnership, we are not going to solve these problems. So a mechanism which includes the G20 members, be it Paris Club or non-Paris Club, is really critical. A coordination mechanism like the old London Club approaches and so on, to bring the private sector together is also going to be very important going forward. And these are issues that we have been really working with. We have just published last week an IMF report on the international debt architecture and what can be done going forward. Looking at, this is mainly on the private sector, looking at collective action clauses, looking at advancements in terms of faster restructurings and so on. And the story is, the bottom line is there's progress, so there's good news, but there's also bad news. We need to have better system going forward, and that the creditor composition has changed so much that we actually need better coordination as well as new methods in terms of dealing with these issues, new coordination procedures. What I think, and I will finish with this because we can come back to some of the other points I wanted to raise later. What will be very important also is, although this is not our baseline scenario, there is a risk that we may have systemic issues, debt issues, right? Because the case-by-case approach has its limitations. We have been dealing with it. IMF has done this many times, as you know, in the context of our programs. We do that sustainability analysis and then have a mechanism for that can be restructured as needed or reprofiled. But I think what is going to be important going forward is to also plan in case we have more than a handful of cases that we have to deal with. I hope this doesn't take place, but we need to have contingency planning. And that will, and as we discuss in that paper, that has two components. One is what we call carrots. These could be IFI financed buybacks or providing cash for settlement. So debt where the official sector can also take a role. It has to be thought through very carefully because it has pros and cons. And then the sticks are statutory approaches like anti-vulture fund legislation or the UN-style legislation, which again, these are nuclear options, should not be put in unless it's last resort. So we need to extend the DSSI, which has been important, work with countries which have unsustainable debt and reprofile them. Hopefully that's only a few cases. And third, we need to think about, if this is to be a systemic crisis, how do we deal with it? Do we make sure that our drawer plans are ready to deal with such an outcome? Hopefully we don't need to deal with. I stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jayla. We'll come back, no doubt, to how close we are to the point where we should be preparing at least some of these, what you call tactical nuclear options, uh, and whether the time required to prepare them is such that, in a way, it's how far should one advance that work? And I mean, if you look back at the history of debt resolution and debt crises, I think this point that you've raised earlier is that, historically, we've always tried to find sort of incremental solutions before we actually take on board what is ultimately needed in many of these cases. And it just takes a bit of time, but you also need that time to build the consensus that those things need to be done. So I'm sure we'll come back to some of that. Gargi, I want to turn to you, and I also want to, I think everybody on this panel I'm welcoming for the first time in their new role. So congratulations to you also on your new role. I wanted to get your perspective on all of this, but one dimension we haven't talked about at all so far in terms of financing is really whether some of the priorities end up getting short shrift as financing gets squeezed. And, I'm particularly worried as I look at what's been happening historically in a post-crisis phase to spending on education and on health in many countries. This time around, of course, the crisis is a health crisis. So there's a big rush right now for people to put money into certain aspects of health security and dealing with the pandemic. But, as you know better than most, the problems of health in most low-income countries go well beyond dealing with a pandemic. So sort of any sense that you have on that sort of issues. And then, so you, I think, are very much in touch with a lot of the donor countries in their efforts in low-income countries. And then you see this worrying trend that in the middle of the pandemic, actually, the OECD DAC says that in the ODA numbers this year are likely to go down rather than up. And, when I first saw that, I thought that I'd misread it. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So any light that you can throw on that would be great too.
Sure. Thank you, Masood, and thanks to CGD for having me, especially in this group, because as you say, at the Gates Foundation, we are certainly aware of and operating in the broad macro fiscal context, but our focus is actually on a unique slice on human capital, and within that, really heavily focused on health. But of course, this is one of those moments when health is macro critical, as the fund likes to say. So I want to talk a bit about what we're seeing in the health sector and a particular moment for international economic cooperation now. As you and others have said over the course of the past few days, among many effects, the pandemic has halted 20 years of development progress in its tracks. And we're seeing on the health side, 25 years of progress in immunization coverage set back in 25 weeks. On malaria and TB, we think we're losing kind of 5 years of gains. Double the number of people facing acute food insecurity, both now and projecting forward. So this is a sort of profound human crisis as well. And we know that economic activity will remain depressed until we solve the root cause of this, which is the virus. So before we can talk about recovery, we have to talk about ending the pandemic. And the foundation has, for the past several months been very focused in our upstream R&D portfolio on filling the pipeline of therapeutics, diagnostics, vaccines. There's lots of R&D, and that community has mobilized faster and more collaboratively than I think we thought possible before this moment. We also have been really pleased to see many of the critical pharmaceutical companies coming together to commit to affordable access for low-income populations, which is really going to be critical, right? Because we know when we start to see advances in vaccines that we won't have sufficient capacity to vaccinate the entire world all at once. And so committing to a set of principles for global action is really critical. There's some modeling coming out of Northeastern University that sort of illustrates that cooperation actually gets us out of this problem faster. Vaccinating just high-income countries leads to twice as many deaths than a kind of globally organized plan of vaccination. So those are the kinds of issues that we are really focused on and need to be kind of first on the agenda for international economic cooperation. Why do I say economics? Because to get this done, we're looking at multilateral cooperation and country financing and country planning at a level and at a speed that will be unprecedented, as others have said. So the ACT-A collaboration is an association of global health institutions, IFIs, countries, pharmaceutical companies, who are the right stakeholders to bring together to think about how do we do this? How do we develop a vaccine faster? How do we develop the norms for global access that put healthcare workers first around the world to get economies restarted? How do we put in place the financing to procure and distribute vaccines? And Masood, as you said at the outset, we know that it will not be enough to just parachute in vaccines. Healthcare systems, primary health systems, have been debilitated by the financing impacts, the restrictions on movements that we're currently undergoing. And so we will also need institutions like the bank, country health, working with country health systems to restart primary healthcare. So those numbers are, if you just think about vaccines, Gavi, which is a key coordinating alliance that will procure and distribute vaccines to 90 plus countries around the world. Those numbers are on the order of $5, $6, $7 billion just for the critical first tranche of vaccinations to get economies up and running again. And then, we will need 2x that to support health systems to get restarted. So, as we talk about the extension of debt suspension, as we talk about special multilateral replenishments, including potentially for IDA, we're really focused on how do we spend those resources well to maximize the economic and the human impact. And so we're really focused on the collaboration that will be required among all parties, global health and economics, to get us started again. I will say, just in closing, that we are also learning so much about the ability of the international system to respond to a future pandemic. And much as we emotionally are not ready to talk about that yet, we know we have to be prepared. And so coming out of this, we will need the systems to push out liquidity, which happened very well fast. We will need the systems to collaborate on norms of distributing medical interventions from PPE to vaccines. We will need the kind of money in the international system that can take the risk to fund R&D and to build manufacturing capacity to scale interventions quickly. We will need the forums to be having these conversations even faster and with more preparation next time. Let me stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Masood.
Thank you very much, Gargi. And, I think what you just said brought very sharply into focus an issue which so many people in Minister Ahmed's position are going to have to grapple with, which is that resources are going to be tight as domestic resources have taken a hit, and we know it takes a bit of time to get them up and running. Order flows are already not going up, going down a little bit. And although the IFIs, I think, have done a very good job of coming in quickly, continuing on that trajectory is actually harder for them for reasons that we can get into, which are because they have to move from sort of the emergency phase into providing longer term financing, and that's not as easy to get done for everyone. And we have to think through how to look at issues, as you said, of replenishment, of business models, so resources are tight. And you've just laid out sort of very eloquently the set of really high priority things that need to be done in terms of global health security, national health security, and then looking at health more broadly. And I can sort of also imagine a conversation with people who would be making equally strong case right now for saying, we need to make sure everybody gets back into school, and girls don't go off into early marriage, and boys don't go off into child labor, and we need to sort of get the kids back in school. And then there's also this big discussion right now about building back better and greener. So there is a sort of infrastructure that is climate friendly agenda out there. And then there's all my friends in the DFIs who are essentially pushing very hard right now for saying that if you let all these small, medium enterprises go under without giving them the support for the next few years, there won't be anything to build back from. So we have to sort of do that. And so I can see a lot of claims, each really compelling, piling up. And it's very, it's intrinsically very hard to figure out what is the way to arbitrate across these claims, and how do people make choices, and is that best done at the country level, or are there some global priorities that one pursues? And I think thinking that through, what you've just said really puts that issue very much on the table. And everybody, I think, would agree that right now you have to move forward on those global health issues you just outlined, because without that, we're not going to solve even the economic crisis. But I can see that kind of problem coming back to ministers. And I wanted to come back to you, Minister Ahmed, before we bring in the participants on this and get, you must be facing this challenge right now. You're just doing the budget, you said, you've been presenting the budget. And in addition to all of these reasons, there's umpteen politicians in different areas who all want some of that spending that you've been talking in your budget about to meet their local community needs as well. So how are you dealing with this trade-off right now? What's your advice to people thinking about it? You're still on mute. There you go.
Thank you again,
Thank you.
Mashood, for the second opportunity. Yes, this is a difficult time to be responsible for resource management or resource allocation. But I can tell you that in the budget that we just presented, we were able to increase health provision by 155%. And we also increased the spending on education by 65%. We made sure that there is sustained spending also and provision for social investment to help the poor and the vulnerable. this is against a background of we still need to provide for infrastructure and security and generally look out for the welfare of the people. But our view is that while it is easy to go out and borrow for large infrastructure projects like roads, bridges, and rail, that we need to use our own local resources to build human capital. So that's the focus of our next year's budget is developing better resilience so that when such headwinds happen, we're able to cope better. We also have a unique opportunity now that we're rebuilding our healthcare system. So if anything, we will be coming out of COVID with a better healthcare system than when it started. So if anything, that's a plus, and we're very happy about it. It's still going to be a difficult year, 2021, but we're going to go into a recession that is not as deep as maybe other countries. Our country has, in terms of the slowdown in growth, has fared much better than other countries. Second quarter GDP was a minus 6.1%, while some economies have gone as far as 30% negative growth. So we're looking at recovering in 2021. We're rolling out a stimulus package that we put together in a plan that we call Economic Sustainability Plan. The focus is to address the health challenge, create jobs, and help small, medium-sized enterprises so that they stand on their feet and they don't go under, and they grow and employ more people. A lot of public works, putting our young people to actually physically go out there, build roads, build social, low-cost housing. So we're just putting people to work with their hands and put as much as possible money into the hands of people while they work.
Thank you, Minister. I think, Mary Lou, if you agree, I thought this is a good time to bring not only distinguished but patient group of participants who have been listening so far, but have not yet had a chance to engage with this conversation. So could I ask all of our participants now to turn on their videos as well, and then to remind you that the way in which you would get the floor is if you could go to the participants' little thing at the bottom, and then when you click on that, you'll see raise hand as one of the things that you can do. And if you click on raise hand, then your hand will be raised electronically, and we will be able to turn to you. So let's see now, who would like to lead off? Anybody who has any questions or comments or points that you would like to make? Shanta, is that you trying to raise your hand electronically?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it is.
Okay, off you go.
Thanks. Well, thanks very much. And welcome.
You know, also, I think just simpler methods like raising your hand physically and waving will do the job. Okay, off to you, Shanta.
Great. Thanks very much. And thank you for this very, very interesting discussion. Particularly, I thought the panelists, the discussion around the panelists was actually quite different from the presentations that Sudhir gave. And that's what I wanted to, the comment I wanted to make, because the presentations on financing were all based around this idea that there was a need for more resources to achieve the SDGs. And then the question was, how do you finance those resources? That's the proverbial billions to trillions, or domestic resource mobilization, or debt relief. But what I found interesting was that the panelists were all focusing on how, when you get those resources, you should spend it. And I think that was the part that was missing in the first discussion, because the real issue for all of us in trying to achieve the SDGs is improving the effectiveness of public spending. And this, as Gargi was pointing out earlier, has gotten much sharper because there are even harder trade-offs involved, especially with immunization and other expenditure priorities. So and coming back to what Sudhir said, the composition of public expenditures and the effectiveness of public expenditures is deeply political. The reason why public spending doesn't reach the clinics or the schools, the reason why teachers are absent from the schools or the doctors are absent from the clinics, or unqualified teachers get hired, is because these are all politically captured. And I think we really have to confront this squarely, particularly with the COVID crisis, if we want to actually achieve the SDGs. So I would like to see a discussion. And I said, I think Minister Ahmed also raised it, talking about energy subsidies or the electricity tariffs. These are all parts of the composition of public expenditures that we should be trying to fix. And I would put a high priority on this over the financing mechanism. Thanks.
Thank you, Shanta. Actually, yesterday in the DRM session that we had, there was a bit of a conversation precisely around the fact that, we tend to think of domestic resource mobilization as a capacity plus technology agenda, whereas in fact, it's essentially a political agenda. And the reason why the structure of taxes is what it is in most countries is not because it just sort of happened to descend that way. It's because that is the result of a series of delicate political compromises that have been made along the way to raise resources while keeping support from various groups whose support is needed by the people who are making the decisions. So I think you're absolutely right. And maybe we need to have a bit more of a conversation around that set of issues. I've got Louis next, and then I have Evelyn, and then Nonso in my list. Louis.
Thank you, moderator, and I welcome this discussion, especially a number of the points raised by the panelists. I would like to pick up on two issues, if you permit me. One is on the issue of the debt. I'd follow up on the discussion by the IMF representative. Is it Sila, if I've got that correct? I think for a number of the low-income countries, if you go back 5 to 10 years, when they took on the debts, it would have been classified as good debt because a number of them actually focused this debt on infrastructure. And the intention was to accelerate growth and development. They now find themselves in a situation where the debt levels are very high. They have some ongoing projects. Some of these debts are not yet in arrears. So as we start thinking of a debt solution, what happens to the ongoing projects? Do we start disbursements? So that's one question. I mean, what do we do? Two is that we have some of these creditors who have got very high, one would say, underlying collateral. Some of them actually have taken on export receipts going forward. How do you restructure in that situation where someone has got very good underlying collateral? I think there are certain things that need to be thought of by the IMF. And I agree with everything else that you said, that there is need for very strong coordination among the traditional lenders, non-traditional, and private sector. Now, my second point relates to private capital and how we can unlock. There are some points that came out in the presentation by Sudhir, and I want to underscore some of those. I think there's going to be a very strong role by the DFIs. I agree that the model needs to change, and I just want to flag two components. There is a lot of, we have very many participants in the private sector who have gone in for low-risk projects and very high returns. We need the DFIs to come in and go in for maybe the high-risk and low-return projects. And they have that model, whichever model they choose, should be such that they include guarantees so that we can accommodate some of these very high-risk, low-return projects if we have to increase FDI to the developing countries and especially the low-income countries. And they must also play a catalytic role. They must be ready to use guarantees and insurance for us to get more capital to the developing countries. Thank you. Those are my 2 points for now.
Thank you very much, Louis. And I think on your second point, I'm hoping that when Alfonso comes in, he will be able to say a little bit about whether that's a viable role for the DFIs to play. I think I had Evelyn on next.
Thank you so much, Masood, for inviting me to this, conference. And just for all the panelists and the presenters, I think you have laid out very good points, and I want to think that the past 2 days were very informative. And I really agree on what was said regarding, being strategic in borrowing and having good debt, especially, for African countries, borrowing to invest in infrastructure. And I think many of them are realizing that that's a priority area, and they're doing that. So I have 2 questions. One question, I think Luis touched on that a little bit, but I just want to ask in a different way on debt sustainability. And then the other one is on domestic resource mobilization. So I'm working on a book on China, and it's obvious that China is, it's in Africa. Nearly every country is running to China, for easy funds. China doesn't come with any, their funds don't come with conditions. They don't discriminate these countries. And so it's very much easy for African countries to go to China. And what I found out is that much of the fund that's coming from China is in the form of loans. So that raises the issue of debt. And so I'm just wondering, maybe first on Charlie, I think, what is IMF doing and other, financial institutions doing to bring China on board? That's number one. And then the other part at a more country level, to Honorable Ahmed, what's the role of China in Nigeria, for example? How is it complementing funds from other traditional donors? And how dependable are funds from China? So that is the first part. The second one is on domestic resource mobilization. We know that many African countries have for a long time depended on foreign aid. And in many instances, foreign aid has been a substitute for, tax collection. They focus more on, receiving foreign aid rather than developing a structure to mobilize domestic resources. And that's a big issue, especially during this time for COVID-19, whereby the donor countries are also facing their own problems with regarding to handling the COVID-19 crisis. So my question is, I haven't done much research in this area, But what are these countries, what were they doing before COVID-19 to mobilize resources? I've been to some countries who have found, for example, a country like Tanzania, the president in that country is very, very aggressive with, increasing tax mobilization. But other countries are very lax, and of course, corruption comes into that equation. So how were they mobilizing their taxes, and what are they doing to actually increase that? And then the other part is that many of these countries, African countries, almost 50 to 80% of their economies are in the informal sector. And that's a huge part of the economy. And if only that sector could be formalized or come up with a way to be able to collect taxes from that sector, then I think their tax mobilization would be a little bit much better than it is right now. So what can be done to actually formalize or at least come up with a structure to be able to collect revenues from the informal sector?
Thank you very much, Evelyn. So China and the informal sector, will come to both. And I think that I had Nonso next.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a great panel so far. My question kind of touches on what Shanta mentioned. Even before COVID, many African countries have been at this juncture, trying to transition away from resource revenues, which have dwindled, to more broad tax revenues. And I think, as Sheila mentioned, that hasn't kind of worked out so well. There's been lots of technical support, lots of ideas, but in practice, many countries still haven't made that migration. And so my question is, to what extent is this really a juncture where a political solution is kind of needed to move the needle? Not necessarily to collect taxes, more taxes today, but to build back a better structure that can increase resource mobilization going forward. Just to give an example, in many countries, personal income taxes are a big part of all taxes collected by governments. But in Nigeria, for example, there is no federal personal income tax. And if you add that the economy has a very large informal structure, then you can kind of see how there are very big gaps here. But this is not a technical problem. It's not a problem that can be solved by economists like myself with fancy models. It's really a political solution. And so to what extent is this the time to start to think about how to make those political changes that can result in a change in trajectory? Because the debt problem is really a problem about revenue, especially for countries like Nigeria, where the debt itself is relatively small, but revenue is just a lot smaller. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nonso. I think Annalisa and then Alfonso.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thanks to Marilu and Masoud for bringing us together virtually. This is actually a vital type of debate. Let me make first a kind of reflection question, and I very much second what Shanta mentioned at the very beginning. I'm quite glad that we're discussing the financing for what, but somehow a bit of a reflection. I mean, we know government resources can be fungible, but we also know that many governments prioritize non-concessional finance for large-scale infrastructure projects and grant financing, for instance, for project preparation facilities. And might be reluctant to borrow for this kind of area. So my kind of question is like, would countries borrow for certain sectors and areas if this is the only option available to that? And if so, under what conditions to make them viable? And should grants be channeled and ring-fenced for the social sectors? So this is a kind of a first reflection. And Masoud always pushes us to be action-oriented. I'm not sure I'm very creative, but if we're thinking around the challenge many bilateral donors have in scaling up their own budgets, even though so far we had only a couple of announcements of cuts. So far we had ring-fencing budgets and also a couple of them increased, but at least for this budget cycle. So we need to think around how to stretch and increase the leverage of this budget. So two quick reflections. The first one is not particularly creative, but provided the focus is on effectiveness and leveraging, channeling as much as possible towards the multilateral development banks will be a very good investment. Particularly the kind of leverage effect of capital vis-a-vis the lending capacity, not only for and primarily for non-concessional windows, but also to a certain extent for the soft windows. And the second point, and the final one, we're talking about here financing low-income countries. So my action might sound a bit odd, but I think many bilateral donors should learn how to work better with middle-income countries, and particularly upper middle-income country spectrum, and concentrate as much financing as possible in low-income countries. We know upper middle-income countries have different financing options available, better market terms, and the incidence of aid is relatively marginal. And also, many uses of finance in upper middle income countries don't really demand financial transfer, but knowledge sharing, peer learning, expertise, which they tend to be more cost effective, less expensive, but they do require different ways of working and skill set across government. So I'll stop here, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Annalisa. I think I'm glad that you raised the issue of middle-income countries. And it's kind of interesting for me that the conversation around middle-income countries is often structured around whether or not donors should allocate concessional money to middle-income countries. And the fact of the matter is that half the ODA actually goes to middle-income countries. So clearly they do. And maybe they shouldn't quite as much, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other useful collaborative things that could be done rather than just allocating ODA to middle-income countries. And that's a conversation that is worth having on what are the most productive engagements one can have. I was thinking that maybe after Alfonso, come back to the minister and to Kargi and Jayla and maybe Mary Lou. I know that almost everybody on this call is saying they want to contribute, but rather than go through it all and then come back to panelists, let's make it a little more interactive and have one round of any reactions that you have, and then we will carry on. So Alfonso, and then I'll come back to the panelists.
Thank you, Masood. Thank you very much for inviting me, for inviting IFC to these discussions. Very good to see good friends around the screen. So let me come with two. So if there are two things that, in my opinion, are absolutely critical to really achieve the objective that we have in the title of this panel, one of them is what Shanta definitely mentioned, the effectiveness of public spending. And this is clearly one of the main priorities. And this is very much linked with the DRM agenda. But the second one is the mobilization of private capital. And we know that that's one of the most difficult things to do in low-income countries. These two trends have been exacerbated, or these two issues, these two factors, with COVID-19. First, because the fiscal space is even more limited and will be even more limited. Therefore, the effectiveness of public spending is even more needed than before. But second, because we have lots of liquidity in the market. This is probably one of the moments in history with more liquidity in the financial markets, but actually where that liquidity is going to those probably assets that we don't want it to go. So we have a huge flight to quality and a very large difficulty in moving this liquidity to the objectives that we are discussing today. So I'm going to focus on this second one. How can we make this liquidity move to low-income countries? What is needed? Why we cannot unlock private capital mobilization to low-income countries? And I think that there are a combination of three things, which is in fact at the bottom of the strategy, or at the heart of the strategy of IFC. The first one is bankable projects. So it is very important not only to talk about financing, it is important to actually talk about pipeline of projects. And we have huge problems, and we know that in low-income countries to design projects in a way that can really attract private sector. And the worse the design is, the more the subsidy that we need, or the concessional financing that we need to really take the tail risk of this project. So I think there is an urgent need to really work upstream and to really work on designing the projects in a way that can really attract in a better way private capital. The second one is what we call the cascade approach at the World Bank Group, which is in a way the idea that those projects that can be financed with private sector let the private sector do it. Don't use the public resources to do it if the private sector can do it according to the criteria in terms of efficiency and equity that is needed. No? But the third one is the use of blended finance, and that's why we have the private sector window as one example of how we can, in addition to design the project in terms of upstream, so the pipeline, the design of the project, together with the policy approach on how to bring the private sector and when, we also need a financing instrument. We need a concessional finance. We need blended finance. And the issue is, how should we use this blended finance? How this should be used in different countries and sectors? That's a different question. No? But I think that we really need to focus on the combination of these three pieces, because if we only go to one of them, we will not be able to solve the problem. So what Luis was mentioning before, should DFIs or MDBs go to finance only high risk, low return projects? Maybe yes, but the main issue here to me is not to finance this as a one-off. The issue is how DFIs and MDBs can really mobilize private sector, can really play the catalytic role that is needed in order to make this financing sustainable. Because otherwise we will do a one-off investment that will not really solve the problem of going from billions to trillions. To make it sustainable, we really need to work upstream. Otherwise, we'll never be sustainable. No? And I think that there are good examples that we could discuss later with the panel, no? Like very briefly, but like Masar in Afghanistan. No? It's a project that I was so absolutely amazed when I learned about it. No? Afghanistan is a country that only 30% of the population has access to electricity. 30% of the population. Investing in electricity in Afghanistan, mobilizing private sector capital to invest in Afghanistan is not an easy task. You really need the combination of the three things that I mentioned before: upstream, cascade, and blended finance. Thanks to this, 6 years, the World Bank Group has been working on this project, and now they have invested in generation to increase the generation capacity of Afghanistan by 1/3. So I think that this is a good example on how you can bring the three pieces and have an impact on the ground. No? So let me stop here, but indeed, looking forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. So I'm going to turn to the panelists, but just before doing that, I just want to give Veda Poon a chance to intervene, because I know she has a conflicting commitment. Veda.
Thanks, Masood. I hope you can hear me, and hello to all panelists. I will just be really brief because I know, Masood, you like to be action-oriented, and I wanted to pick up on the points that colleagues mentioned on the DSSI and what comes after it. And in fact, you know, we're in a very live negotiation at the moment at the G20 on the extension of the DSSI, but also what comes after it. I mean, I think the first thing is that we're still learning lessons from DSSI implementation. As Chela and others will know, you know, we're collecting the data, trying to reconcile it to see how much impact has actually been made and how it has actually helped the countries who are eligible. But I would say actually the bigger decision and the bigger prize, you know, that is on our doorstep, but you know, we're really not there yet, because you know, the finance ministers meeting of the G20 is at the end of next week. We're in a live negotiation at the moment on what follows the DSSI, and there is a live negotiation on something called the common framework, which is, you know, for countries that will need more substantive, you know, debt restructuring and debt reductions post DSSI. Like, what is the structure for that, and how do we deal with it on a case-by-case basis? But also picking up on Chela's point that the kind of big prize is creditor coordination. Also with the private sector. And I think here, you know, without being too grandiose, there is a chance to break some ground, because I think the fact is, you know, there's a lot of non-Paris Club creditors who will need to participate in coordination, and the architecture really isn't perfect. But the common framework is a really good opportunity to try and make this happen and include the private sector and get the G20 and the Paris Club to work on the same platform. So as I say, this is really live at the moment, and certainly from the UK chair, we are working very hard to try and get the framework agreed. It's definitely not a dead set, because there will be countries around the table who are hesitant and who regard this as binding on their sort of domestic decision-making space and capability. So I guess my point here is, you know, people's support on getting that framework through and convincing all members around the G20 table to put their name to it, I think would be really helpful. So with that sales pitch, I'm going to let you go, but thank you for letting me come in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vita. No, I think that's really helpful because clearly, it may be too early to think about some options, but as Jayla and you and others have said, now's the time to start putting together a framework for looking at the next steps and the coordination that'll be needed to deliver on them. So I'm going to come back to the panelists for any quick reactions now, and then bring in the other speakers. So let me start with you, Minister Ahmed.
Very much, Mr. Masood. Very interesting intervention so far. And what's running through our minds, most of us ministers of finance, is that yes, for both middle income and low income countries, there's a need to provide some relief in the form of maybe reduced cost of borrowing, in some cases credit enhancement, in other cases maybe even restructuring of the debts, getting terms near to concession. But all of this does not obviate the need to have very significant, meaningful reforms in our countries. So this is the time that political will has to be really exerted to make some very difficult and hard decisions, because those are the things that will be sustained and those are the things that can stay. Speaking for my country, Nigeria, well, our debt level, like Nonso has said, is not high. We're struggling because the revenue is low. And a country of about 200 million people having a tax base of about 45 million people tells you how hard it is. So there's still a large number of our people not paying taxes. And this includes the 65% informal we have. That's the largest proportion of the economy. But there's businesses that are not registered, some not even in the financial system, and therefore are not paying taxes. Early this year, before the advent of COVID, we had passed into law a finance bill that actually reduced taxes for small, medium enterprises. We took the lowest categories and say paying tax, so it's 0%. And then the next level is with taxes from 30% to 20%. Our hope is that this will encourage these businesses to invest more in their businesses and to grow, and also to become formalized packages that requires that you have some kind of formalization. So there's an incentive when you are registered, when you have a bank account, when you have a BVN, there's an incentive that you are able to access some grants or some very low cost finances. So we do have to expand our domestic revenue mobilization efforts. In our case, by simply expanding the tax base, we're not looking at increasing taxes. If anything, we've reduced taxes, and if we have to, then we can even reduce further for other categories of businesses, because we just can't continue at the low level of revenues that we have. It's become too stressful.
Thank you. Jayla and then Gargi.
Thank you. Very good points were raised, and actually it's really something that I do want to press a lot at the in my initial points as well, which is the trade-offs and the need for transparency, and the transparency both in terms of debt transparency and investment transparency. You know, this is always important, but particularly so in the current juncture, because if creditors cannot assess a country's true debt situation, they may still be willing to lend it during good times, but they will be much less inclined during bad times. And when countries are in distress, this is needed to give creditors confidence that other lenders are also bearing their fair share of the needed debt relief. So I think debt transparency is really critical at this point. The issues about collateralized lending was raised, which is the case. The issues about sub-debt and so on. So that I would really like to say, we need a reset. We need a reset in terms of transparency. And that goes back to what Shanta was saying as well. It's not just debt transparency, it's also investment transparency. What are governments investing in? How can they ensure accountability? because there needs to be much better accountability in terms of these allocation of resources, both to get the buy-in of citizens, but also making sure that we have flowing finance going forward. We have been saying at the fund, spend, you need to spend, you need to deal with the crisis, but keep the receipts. Keep the receipts to be accountable, keep the receipts in case there's a need for certain restructuring or other forms of treatment going forward. Just to put in context, colleagues, if you look at the response to the crisis, which has been unprecedented, right? The response also has been unprecedented. You have close to 20% of GDP from advanced economies of stimulus packages with liquidity, discretionary fiscal, and so on. About 6% from emerging markets, 1.8% from low-income countries. So their response, it's not whatever it takes, it's whatever they can do. And given that advanced economies are also dealing with this crisis, it's not like financing is coming from everywhere. There will be trade-offs. So the trade-offs will be for countries that reform, like the minister said, that countries that show that growth is foreseeable in the future, that there's transparency and accountability. I think countries that have that will have, it's very difficult, as Shanta said, it's all political, but that's going to be the reality. We are not going to get official money nor private money come to countries unless we deal with this issue of being transparent in terms of spending and in terms of allocation of resources. This other point I want to make on what was just said by Veda is basically really support for this approach that the G20 common framework. This is really critical. This is something that can make a difference now, because this is going to bring everyone around the table in terms of really putting together a common framework to deal with the liquidity, but also the possible solvency problems going forward. So I think support for this at this time is going to be critical. And I want to end by one last issue, which is when debt is unsustainable, delaying it creates much more costs going forward. So, you know, too little, too late. We have research showing this. This needs defaults, the costs rise spectacularly. So the sooner countries start good faith negotiation, collaborative efforts with creditors, the lower the economic and the human cost. So I think this is something to bear in mind, that we cannot just wait. If the situation, preemptive restructuring is going to be critical at this time, and we really need to work with credit rating agencies, work with others like the G20 to make sure the conditions are there to bring preemptively countries to the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think that's really important points to raise. And I think your last point, if you go back and look at the history of unsustainable debt cases, there are many examples where the costs ended up being larger because of delay. I struggle to find a single case where historically we ended up with restructuring debt too early. You know, there aren't any. Gargi.
Thanks, Masood. And thanks to the participants for a great round of comments. We're having a wide conversation across sources and uses. And I'm going to stay a little bit focused on the uses. 2 points. The point about the informal sector, I want to broaden a little bit to say, you know, as expected, the effects of the pandemic are not being distributed equally. And we know that the most vulnerable are faring worse. So whether you look at that through a gender lens, women's jobs are evaporating faster than men's. We know that care work is being distributed unequally. You look at that from an income quintile lens, we know that the safety nets that the poor are typically reliant on have, despite the uptick in significant uptick in cash transfers, basic health services, hot meals in states in India have been on hold, and that is having a disproportionate impact. So the implication of that for me is not necessarily where one participant was going in terms of ring fencing resources, but I do think the pressure is on to finally make use of the tools we have to design equitable policy. So when you think about budget tools, finally bringing in some of the gender lenses we have in that, when you think about DRM, a focus on things like property tax, which are underutilized in sub-Saharan Africa as a sort of progressive approach to taxation, become even more important as we build back better from this crisis. The second point, Masood, I would slightly challenge your take on, boy, there's health and climate and education and so many urgent calls for resources. Clearly, that's true. I would differentiate the end of the pandemic from all of those. I am very happy to be in the camp of making the case for health and education. But actually, I think there is a piece that is really about how we mobilize financing fast to vaccinate and protect people so that we can get to all the other pieces. And I say that again, just because this community who focuses more on the economic dimensions of development is going to be critical. We will not be able to sort of solve this pandemic just in the global health community. So I want to reiterate the criticality of financing the end of the pandemic first. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think, unless we end the pandemic, a lot of the other conversations are a little bit, kind of moot, aren't they? Okay, now, let's see, I have a number of speakers. I want to make sure everybody gets in. So I've got Sufyan, Jaffer, Alex, and also Susanna and Steve on my list. So, and Stephanie, absolutely. Stephanie was there as well. Now, Sufyan, so quickly starting with you.
Thank you very much, Masood. Sudhir also really gave us a very concise and clear summary of the conferences. I found it very interesting, and also thanks the panelists. I have a few comments on each of the source of financing. The first is regarding the domestic resource mobilizations. Here we have the other side of the revenue, the expenditure. From my long experience, the quality of the expenditure of the government is really critical. Is it allocated for priority sectors, health, education, or for others? So we really should also keep in mind how the domestic resources are used. The reforms in this aspect, as absolutely I agree, it requires political commitment. But the technical aspect of it is also very, very important from my long experience, really, to reform the government expenditure, starting from planning to cash management and internal control systems and all other activities require technical assistance. And I know the IMF has the capacity, and donor coordination is really critical. And in this aspect, I again ask the IMF really to take the lead. When it comes to domestic resource mobilizations, here again, the reform really is mainly political, but also the technical aspect is very important. If I'm not mistaken, close to 50% of our tax collection is really lost in the what we call the tax exemption, tax holidays, and so forth. Again, here, the technical aspect of really modernizing our tax collection aspect is very, very important. We should not also underestimate the lack of the capacities. Regarding the private capital flow to LDCs, I think we all know it's not really flowing to less developed countries, particularly in Africa, even before the pandemics. So really my opinion is in the short term, for those less developed countries, really the priority should be really for the ODA and the concessional loans. It should continue to flow to this particular group of countries where the gains that was really achieved in human development over years are under threat. So in the long term, again, we should continue the importance of these private sectors. In this aspect, I have really a question for the moderators, also for our panelists. How do you see the recommendation of the G20 EPG group's recommendations in 2018 regarding, of course, the reform of this international financial institution, also the coordination among themselves? That is the question I have. On the debt sustainability, 2 points. Yes, in the short term, this debt relief is good. We should continue, but we should also keep in mind that this country should not be really denied the access to the market in the future when things improved. Whenever we are talking of this debt relief, debt rescheduling, there is this taboo of really considering these countries as too risky and so on and so forth. So that is my first concern. Second is really borrowing. It should continue. The issue is really the purpose of the borrowing. Is it for consumption? Is it for investment? Otherwise, a borrowing is very important. Again, here, has to emphasize the access in the future to the debt market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sufyan. Jafar.
Thank you, Masood, and let me thank all the panelists for the contribution to this important and timely topic. My first point, Masood, is that when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015, many of us at the fund consider that their achievement will be a major challenge for low-income countries. From the beginning, the main concern has always been how realistic are the prospects for financing to help these countries achieve the SDGs. On this point, as a result of the COVID-19, I think our concern should go beyond the challenges associated with financing prospects. What is really worrying is that because of the rise in debt payments, governments are reacting with cuts in spending. This raises a new concern that we may need to ask ourselves if the SDGs themselves are still realistic. And I would appreciate if the panelists could reflect on this. My second point is, as noted in today's discussions, on rising debt burdens. Even before the COVID-19, debt payments have grown rapidly for LICs since 2011. Unfortunately, and because of the pandemic, this trend has rapidly increased. So an important question is, can the current financial architecture provide prevention and resolution of the next wave of debt crisis, or does it need to be reformed? Of course, strengthening domestic revenue mobilization would help to finance the spending necessary for sustainable development. And here I agree that with the point made by the panelists that such efforts have now taken on greater urgency given the fiscal implications of COVID-19 crisis. I also agree that LICs need a strong political leadership to overcome resistance to reform and to enhance the efficiency of public spending required to make the SDGs, and underlines the urgency of creating considerable fiscal space and a stable source of financing. Also, beyond the resources, institutional and capacity constraints need to be addressed in order to increase spending efficiency. As Cheda mentioned, the fund have reacted decisively to provide emergency support to the membership, but we also recognize the risk on debt sustainability of lending more money. To this end, we took timely action through the debt service suspension initiative to reduce debt burden. However, it is clear that much more debt relief should be provided, including by the G20 countries. The fund is also supporting countries' effort to improve debt management and debt transparency, as Sheila just mentioned. We need, however, to recognize that for some low-income countries, unsustainable debt levels are such that a restructuring may be required. And let me conclude by making suggestions referring to the comment made by Ms. Bush. Many low-income countries have been highly affected by the COVID crisis through falling exports, low commodity prices, declining remittances, and the collapse of tourism. These concerns will be confronted with the added challenges of distribution, accessibility, and affordability of the COVID vaccine once available. I think we need to pay an urgent attention to this issue. I guess Ms. Bush actually referred to this, that her foundation is basically paying some attention. But I think we need to pay, and advanced economies should be willing to provide the vaccine free of charge to the poorest members as a global public good. And the IFIs should set up financing mechanism to help the rest of the membership benefit from a timely availability of vaccine. Thank you, Masood.
Thank you very much, Jafar. Okay, I'm now going to ask our last four panelists to do a very quick intervention so we can close on time. So Alex, a minute to you, please.
Thank you very much. I'll be very quick, and it's been an excellent discussion. You know, one of the powerful roles that CGD really takes on is to reflect on OECD policies and how they impact developing countries. And two things that come to my mind that might set some of our research agenda around that front is when we start to think about choices that the US government, other developed country governments are going to make as a result of their real or perceived national security needs as we emerge from COVID. And these are around climate change, Green New Deal type of things, and changes to supply chains, nearshoring, that choices that may be made by developed country governments. I think both of those things may have real opportunities for less developed countries, and there could be upside for those things. And I really encourage us to begin to think about that now, in addition to thinking about the health crisis, as Gargi pointed out to us. And similarly, as Lewis said at the very start of when we opened up the conversation, the choices that our DFIs and multilateral banks are going to be making are also politically determined by their developed country shareholders. If we are willing to tolerate lower credit ratings at our MDBs, we'll open up hundreds of millions of dollars for additional investment in developing countries. And so there's a real political agenda within the OECD as well that we can all be focusing on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex. Stephanie, quick comment from you, please. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent discussion. I just wanted to say that in these difficult days, as you pointed out, Masood, we have to be realistic. What is actually feasible, not so much what we want. We can push as much as we like for what we want. But for example, I'm a bit skeptical about the likelihood of having very large private financial flows going to LICs. I would think it would be good, provided they go into the right sectors and so on, and not excessive. But I think it's not very realistic. I think there are mechanisms, like Louis, I think very perceptively talked about guarantees. And there is actually a sort of seminal article which by Arrow and Lind, which says that in times of great uncertainty, because it's not just risk that we have great uncertainty, which nobody can quantify, guarantees are a good tool. So maybe, a greater emphasis by MDBs and RDBs on guarantees is warranted today. But in terms of catalyzing private flows, I think we have to be realistic. And I think the best way to try and ensure that more funding gets to low-income countries from abroad is probably to enhance the capital, as you have said, enhance the capital of MDBs and RDBs, which will provide some leverage. It can come with bilateral loans and possibly with some private finance. So it's a good use of scarce public resources, because it is scary, as you said, but understandable that ODA may actually fall. So again, we have to be very targeted on what will work best. I think domestic mobilization of resources, which this conference has highlighted so well, is in the medium term, of course, the key to development and the key to lack of future crises and so on. But I'm not sure how much can be done in the short term. I think one should aim to do as much as possible, but perhaps there are some quick gains, some low-hanging fruits, as economists like to call them. But in the medium and long term, I think that's the main basis for development of LICs.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Realism. So, Susanna, your 1 minute, please.
Thank you so much. I'll be quick. Thanks for the invitation. So on feasibility, but then more connected to domestic resource mobilization, I wanted to raise the issue on trust, the trust in governments and how that has been affected by the crisis itself. Because we all see in different countries how the citizens are reacting to the strategy that countries have had in dealing with COVID. And we've talked also a lot about how what the government is actually doing. So the government expenditures, and obviously the longer the crisis continues, the more squeezed will expenditures be on health, education, and so on, and that will affect the trust the citizens have in the government. So we have a situation where we have a decreased tax revenues, both the collection and because of the economic activity going down, but also the tax rates as a stimulus. And we also subsidize a large part of the economy. So already there, no change in trust. It's very difficult to go back to where we were before. And now with the decreased trust due to what we've done during COVID, that will be even harder. And in some countries, even the unrest created by people living very close to poverty. We just yesterday saw new poverty projections coming out from the World Bank. There might even be reasons to expect unrest and conflict and so on. So my question is should we expect a longer lag between when COVID is dealt with, the economy is recovered, and actually we see a recovery in domestic resource mobilization? And as Sheila was saying, being very much related to the debt situation. Thank you
very much. Steve, 1 minute to you, please.
Thank you. Just briefly, I'm Steve Rosner from USAID, and I focus on public finance issues. And as somebody who has been of late challenged by many of my global health colleagues to help them answer questions about how do we not just recover from the pandemic, but how do we help health systems in our partner countries move to a new equilibrium. I'm going to put sort of a challenge out there to all of us. How do we bring sustainable health financing into the mainstream? Not as something that's not just grappled with by public health professionals and health economists, but also that those of us that focus more squarely on macro fiscal and financial sector reforms are really prepared and incentivized to engage in as well. And in that respect, I think we need to think about how we help to forge more common ground between ministries of health and ministries of finance, helping forge a shared understanding of the health financing challenges and priorities that are out there. And how do we explore opportunities with our partners for new and hybrid approaches to getting closer to universal health coverage, which is a goal for many countries. And this means we need to think beyond purely tax financed health systems, think about what works well in contributions-based approaches, think about more integrated approaches to health systems rather than the silos and disease-based approaches that we deal in. And so I wanted to add that dimension to the conversation so that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is an issue that's going to be front and center well beyond the pandemic. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for making that important connection. So I'm going to just ask our panelists if they have any final thoughts to share in the 3 minutes we have left. So starting with Gargi, and then Jayla, and then end with Mr. Ahmed.
Thanks. I'll just really thank all the participants for the energy following up here. And clearly, we're really focused on the months ahead and securing the finance so that we can begin to work on the build back we've been discussing. Thanks again.
Thank you, Gargi. Jayla?
Sorry, thank you. This was really great. I just want to pick on a point about feasible, what is feasible and what is really urgent to do. And I think they're really working on guarantees, insurance at this point is really critical given the uncertainty, a common framework as we just discussed by the G20. And also coordination across different international institutions. We have the platform on collaboration for tax. As you know, this has helped really our efforts on domestic resource mobilization. What I want to end with is that we also need to acknowledge that the countries have to do more as well. 40% of financial resources from Africa go outside of Africa. Building local markets, making sure that the resources are better utilized. It comes back to Shanta's point. More transparency, better services to people, and making sure that the resources are also utilized better at home. And I think we have a very important agenda on this point as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jayla. Minister Ahmed.
In conversation so far, I'm really glad that I'm here. Somebody raised a question that says, are the SDGs still realistic? So I want to end on that note. I will say that we need to make sure we realize the SDGs now more than ever before, because it's still even now more important that we make sure that there's no poverty, that there's zero hunger, that we have good health, and also quality of education, and that we use industry and innovation to help us leapfrog from where we are now in a lot of our countries at a really low level to make progress, to reduce inequality, and also to make sure that we use forums like this to strengthen the partnerships that is required so that we achieve the SDGs and leave no one behind.
Thank you very much, Minister Ahmed. That's actually a very nice note on which to end. So Mary Lou, anything you want to add before we close?
Just one point, Masood. In terms of realism and the value of international cooperation to make things happen, I think there are really good things happening on vaccine and as well as on the debt issue, on the DSSI and hopefully the common framework. And so I think the next conversation would be essential on the role of DFIs and MDBs and how MDBs can actually adapt themselves for the future, for the challenge going forward, even within their current resources. And of course, the real upside is on what countries will do. And the role of quite a number of institutions and stakeholders in supporting countries do what they can do to do the best they can to release the resources and do the necessary trade-offs will be the real upside of financing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Lou. Thanks for our collaboration on this. Let me just say that I don't really think of realism and ambition as being in opposition. I actually think that realism about being realistic about the diagnosis of where we are is the foundation on which we build ambitious plans to go better. So sometimes if we're not realistic about the problem, then we can not necessarily get into difficult trade-offs that we have to do, but really it is the basis on which we have to do the kinds of things that all of you have outlined. And I want to say this has been a very nice and fitting end to 4 days of conversations on this topic. I want to thank all of you who have participated today with your terrific interventions, but also all of you who have been participating over the past 3 days in the technical sessions. And I also want to thank my colleagues at CGD, Mark Plant, Luisa Mendoza, Amelia, and many others who have been involved in making this happen, as well as our fantastic IT team and events management team that has underpinned it all. So thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to the common framework.
Thank you.